Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Randy Kearns, and for the next 30 minutes or so, I'll go over the basics of burn mass casualty and disaster planning. Um, just a little bit about me. I'm a retired clinical professor from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I taught and conducted research related to disasters, burn operations, burn care, and surge capacity. I'm currently involved in similar programs, although I teach healthcare management and healthcare business administration today at the University of New Orleans. A lot of years ago, I began working as a paramedic. I've taught for a number of colleges along the way. Um, uh, in my early years, in addition to working as a paramedic, I also was in rescue, fire service, EMS, disaster response. I've worked in the state government level and the federal agency of the Federal Emergency Management Agency in disaster, in a number of different disaster responses. So what I'll talk to you about today is somewhat of a reflection of both my own experience and my research. And I have no disclosures to discuss at this point, or no conflicts of interest. So in terms of burn, why is burn important, and how does it help us understand disaster operations? Burn is a small subset of time-sensitive injury and illness. It does fit well in terms of being able to identify the events, analyze the data. The data sets are small, the event numbers are small, but it's a manageable patient population, and there's some scalability to it. It also helps us understand the critical supply and the critical nature of how limited the supply of burn centers are. In the United States, as an example, we have approximately 5,200 hospitals, of which 133 have burn centers. And I'll also add, of those 133, only half of them have more than 2 burn surgeons. So what is a burn disaster? Basically, we're talking about where you have a sufficient number of injured patients that have a burn injury that overextends or exceeds the local capacity to manage them. There's a couple of different ways you may read in the literature that talks about a burn disaster. In some circles, we discuss it as a burn mass casualty incident. I'll also add, here in the US, we're a little bit more likely to call it today a BMCI than a burn disaster, but most of the historical literature still refers to it as a burn disaster. On more of the international front, you may also read of it being discussed as a mass burn casualty, an MBC, but regardless of the nomenclature, the reality is these are interchangeable terms. Incidents of injury, it's somewhat tough to find newer numbers, but what we did find tells us that roughly, so there's about 325 million Americans, about 500,000 will have some type of burn injury each year on a worldwide basis. Of the 7 billion people on the planet, the WHO estimates about 11 million will have some type of a burn injury each year. And basically, as we compare that to other events such as heart attacks or traumatic injuries, these numbers are very, very small compared to other time-sensitive injuries and illnesses. So I'm going to go over 6 key components. I want to talk a little bit about history, plan development, and then some of the resources. So let's start with history. History helps us create context in terms of understanding how a burn disaster occurs and how we plan for that. We can look at historical events. We can do some trend analysis, and again, it kind of helps us understand, as long as we adjust our numbers to reflect the new technology, but it can help us understand what the probabilities are of things that may occur down the road. In terms of historical events, we also can look at frequency. What were lessons that we learned? Sometimes what are lessons that were lost? Meaning, what were things that we should have learned from that disaster, but really didn't carry forward to the next event, and thus the next event looks eerily similar to the last. Data quality, I've mentioned this earlier, and scalability. Because the numbers are small in burn care, there is some scalability in terms of how we look at what occurs in burn care, and we may be able to project that into some other areas where there's also limited and scarce resources, such as pediatric trauma as an example. The last thing I'll talk about, and that's what I'll move into next, we've actually created kind of a type classification to help us stratify the degree of difficulty of each type of burn injury or burn disaster event. And let's kind of move into that. So a type 3 burn disaster, a type 2, and a type 1, this stratification follows the numbering structure we created here in the States in 2008 called the National Incident Management System, NIMS. It helps us, again, put into context how we see a disaster compared to other types of disasters. And so let me start with obviously a burn disaster, but one that is confined just to the burn care system. And the advantage to events like this, although again, you may wind up with an overwhelming number of patients with a burn injury, because it does not impact trauma and some of the other ancillary services in the healthcare system or in the hospital system, it allows us to use trauma surgeons, plastic surgeons, maybe general surgeons to help us with what's going on in the burn world during that sudden surge of patients. Typically, we see that in a nightclub fire or a cafe fire or a theater fire, but where there's a mass gathering event in a confined space that rapidly gets out of hand. And some of the examples that I've included in the presentation, a nightclub fire in China, another one in the United States. I'll later go back to this one. This is a good case study where we have good science that helps us understand how quickly an evening on the town can turn into a catastrophic event. As I said, I'll get back to this one in a few minutes. The Kiss nightclub fire, as much as we would like to say we learned lessons from earlier nightclub fires, we really didn't, and all you have to do is look at the Kiss nightclub fire in Brazil to understand that. And then a type 2 burn disaster is one where usually there's some type of an explosion, whether it's purposeful, as you would find with a terrorist bombing, or it's accidental, where there's a chemical plant explosion. I've got a couple of those examples. But why that's important is to understand that the burn surgeons may be tied up taking care of burn patients, but the trauma surgeons can't really help because they're typically tied up taking care of patients with traumatic injuries. And so it does stress the system even that much more so because of who you can't rely on to help you, because they have their own subset of patients that they need to deal with. And some of the examples that I've included in the literature are the Bali terrorist attack, Madrid train bombing, the London attack, the Boston Marathon bombing, and the chemical fire and explosion in China in 2015. All of these are good examples of how you wind up with concomitant injuries that are both traumatic in nature and may have some burn injury, or some isolated burn and some isolated trauma. But regardless, you can't really rely on the trauma surgeons to help you this time. And then probably the most catastrophic is a type 1 disaster, and that's where you have some type of event that substantially damages infrastructure. And the reason that's important is for us to be able to provide our service, our hospital needs to be intact. The streets have to be open for the ambulances to be able to transport patients to us, or in some cases transport patients away as we try to decompress the hospital that's been overwhelmed by patients. And where infrastructure has been damaged, that becomes the most catastrophic event for us to deal with. And again, some examples. This is from nearly 50 years ago, but it was an earthquake that, although and I'm looking off at a different screen, this building is obviously intact. This was another building that was very similar to this. And in this building, 49 people were killed or crushed by the collapse of the building. And it does give you an idea of when we have this massive building collapse, during a disaster, it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, for us to continue to provide our service if we've had infrastructure damage. The Northridge earthquake, again, damaged hospitals. This is on the west coast of the United States. The 9/11 terrorist attacks really didn't damage hospitals, but damaged our ability to transport patients, either by interrupting the flow of traffic. There was a ground stop for all air travel, and therefore we were unable to evacuate a lot of people by air that we could have moved to other hospitals and neighboring metro areas. So even though the terrorist attacks really didn't destroy hospitals, it did substantially impact the infrastructure. And of course, the Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, again, a great example of destroying infrastructure, making it very difficult to evacuate patients, making it very difficult when you get to the hospital to take care of those patients because of the damage. Haitian earthquake would be another good example, as well as the East Japan earthquake and tsunami. So again, in terms of type stratification, we followed the NIMS guide, which is obviously a type 1 is the most severe of our scenarios, but it just creates a frame of reference of how we compare burn disasters with other types of disasters. So let's go back to that case study I mentioned earlier. This occurred the 20th of February 2003. There were approximately 355 people in the nightclub at the time of the fire. And this kind of gives you an idea of the layout of the bar. Again, if you can imagine about 300 to 350 people either in this immediate area or maybe back in this smaller bar area or over here in the main bar area. But a majority of the people were out here on the dance floor enjoying the music from the band. It just so happened that they wanted to use fireworks with their show. They were unable to find some indoor fireworks, and they wound up using outdoor fireworks around a lot of combustible material, and it obviously did not work well. So the National Institutes of Standards and Technology recreated the event. And so with that, let me show you what their recreation looks like. So at 0 seconds is the ignition point. So you notice the fireworks being ignited on each side of the stage. That's at 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 50 seconds, 60 seconds, 70 seconds, 80 seconds, 90 seconds. Can you imagine a room full of 250, 300 people who, in some cases, many were intoxicated, being confined to 4 exits to try and escape this building in less than 90 seconds. Another way to think about this is, and this is just the visualization, so you can't see. Let's look at the thermal images at the same time. This is at 80 seconds, and if you'll notice at 80 seconds, and this is also in Celsius, so obviously this probably translates better to an international audience, since I'm usually having to explain what 100 degrees Celsius means at times for folks who use Fahrenheit. But anyway, if you'll notice these gradients, and let's look at 80 seconds, 85 seconds, you begin to have flashover. And at 90 seconds, flashover is complete. You have an area, the predominant dance floor area of and around the stage is completely uninhabitable. So let's kind of move on into plan development. Again, I like to use that example as a way to help people understand that a burn disaster occurring very quickly can occur in a lot of different places around the world. It's not just unique to, there are different types of disasters, at least here in the States, that are a little bit more unique to certain geographical areas. That type of scenario I just showed you could occur in literally any city in the US, or for that matter around the world. So let's talk next about basic plan development. What are the basic considerations? and we'll segue somewhat into state planning and surge planning. Two quotes that I like to use when I talk about basic plan development both come from generals. One was General Eisenhower, who oversaw the planning of the D-Day operation, and he was fond of saying, plans are nothing, planning is everything. And it does remind you the importance of the planning process. It also reminds you of the importance of relationships. You create relationships in terms of how you train or educate people together. Think about the friends and your professional network that you've created through the years. You're far more likely to know and trust people during a disaster if it's somebody you know. And that's a part of the planning process, is getting to know people. It's not just about writing a paper plan. Another one was General Shoemaker is probably less well known internationally, but he oversaw a rescue attempt after one of the American embassies was captured, and several of the people in the embassy were held hostage. In 1979, there was an attempt in the spring of 1980 to rescue them. As the helicopters were flying across the desert in an attempt to get to where the embassy was, they encountered a sandstorm. It compromised the operation. Several aircraft crashed, killing several soldiers who were attempting to be involved in the rescue. And his point was, never confuse enthusiasm with capability. And I'll add capacity to that too. It is important to recognize your capability and your capacity. It's great to be enthusiastic, and it's great to have passion and want to be able to do a good job, but it's got to be more. The planning process, and whether we, again, I'm looking away to a different screen, but whether it's an exercise or a real world response, it's important that based on our plan analysis, as real events take place or as we exercise our plan, we have to understand the operational component of how our plan works. After that, we look for lessons learned. Probably the one thing I don't have on this slide is, if it's an exercise, immediately after the exercise, we actually tend to refer to that as a hot wash. The whole point is to, as quickly as possible, get what people are thinking about the exercise. After a real world event, it's a little bit more difficult at times to get people reassembled to help understand what happened. But an after action report does influence how you revise your plans, conduct your training, continue to take corrective action, and then continue the planning process again. From a burn center standpoint, it's important to talk about both the local aspect of it as well as the state, and then regional, national, or international level. And that this state and certainly governmental level stuff really varies depending on what country you're in. You know, in countries that are much larger, where they can rely on lots of mutual aid from other neighboring jurisdictions that are part of their country, it's a lot easier to talk about and plan for intrastate and interstate cooperation. Where it's a lot more difficult is when you're a country and your neighbors, you know, things don't work as well between you and your neighbors. Israel is a good example of that. We like to look to Israel because Israel gives us creative ideas of how they can rely on themselves, be self-reliant, and use force multiplication type strategies to deal with surges of patients. It's not exactly like they can rely on a lot of their neighboring countries to be able to help them. In the U.S., on the other hand, you know, there's 50 states. Typically, those states are the boundaries between the states are fairly transparent. We'll talk a little bit in just a minute about some of the limitations there, but for the most part, they're transparent, and it does make it easier for us to move patients from one healthcare system to another as needed, particularly during a disaster. So let's kind of drive into the state planning at this point. talking specifically about the government aspect of planning, it's important to involve the first responders and the first receivers, whoever that local hospital is and the local EMS system. Remember, the paramedics, the EMS system, those folks are the tip of the spear. When you dial your emergency number, whether it's 911 or 999 or 113, whatever you use, it's important to remember that they're typically the first ones or on the front line of dealing with those things. So your plan has to start with them. And so your planning assumptions also have to include, again, what other type of help can you rely on, or what's not there. Again, here in the United States, we have mutual aid options available. There's interstate response teams that are available. And then on a national level, there's also some national agencies that provide some additional response. Occasionally, there are planning barriers because we have a capitalistic approach to a lot of things in the U.S., and that includes healthcare. That also means that sometimes there are facilities competing for patients, and that has to be a strategy we have to take into consideration when we're looking at assigning patients during a disaster. There's also some intrastate tendencies, meaning we tend to look within our own state for help. Sometimes we look at the state boundary as almost an imaginary line that creates some difficulty moving back and forth, but more times than not, it's a more perceived problem than it is a real problem. There are some geographical limitations. Obviously, it's a lot more difficult to get resources to Alaska or patients from Alaska or Hawaii than it is states that are in the contiguous 48. And for that matter, on the East Coast, we have far more resources than on the West Coast, other than the states of those states that border the Pacific Ocean. We used to look at 3 windows in time in a burn disaster. Today, we actually have talked about a 4th window in time, and this is driven just based on our own assessment of how long it would take to do some things in the United States. The immediate event can occur anywhere. It's also known as a no-notice event. It occurs and you got to deal with it. And so whatever you have coming in, that's what you have coming in. And again, you're going to deal with it for a short period of time, but then you move into that 6 to 120 hour window of time. Again, on the East Coast, you're more likely to be closer to 6 to 24 to 36 hours. That between that initial event and the first 48 hours, you're generally going to have patients where they need to be, and you can assess what's going on. The further we get out west, at least in the United States, the more difficult it is for us to redistribute patients because of how far, how sparsely located, populated some of those areas are. And so it's a lot more difficult to move patients in Salt Lake City and some of the Dakota, or in North or South Dakota, Wyoming, Colorado. Those states don't have nearly as much population as a place like California or certainly East Coast states. And so it makes it a lot more difficult. But the point is, we created that end point of 120 hours. We believe, and most of our models will predict, that within 120 hours, we should be able to distribute up to about 2,000 patients in the United States. And no longer be in what's considered crisis standards of care. And I'll talk about conventional contingency and crisis standards of care shortly. But again, the aim is to get to a high census area, but a normal operation where people can reasonably expect either a contingency or a conventional standard of care. In the fall of last year, we started working on a paper that quite honestly envisioned a catastrophic event. We actually talked about a pandemic event, but we had no idea we would be facing what we're facing right now. But the whole point was to recognize that there's a 4th window out there, in that in a truly catastrophic event, such as a nuclear device detonation. And actually I have a slide for that. So let's talk about it in this context. Again, surge capacity, the literature talks about, and we've talked about before, conventional, contingency, and crisis surge capacity. Conventional and contingency, as a reminder, the standards of care there are basically the same. Conventional is where it's exactly the same no matter where you are. Contingency is where you're relying on some people maybe outside of their discipline, but doctors are taking care of patients and nurses are taking care of patients. We may be relying on some people who haven't been a physician for a while, or they're an ophthalmologist doing things other than taking care of eye emergencies. Crisis surge capacity, quite honestly, we're doing the best we can with everybody we have in spaces that aren't routinely designed to take care of patients. And we don't want to stay in crisis surge any longer than possible. But we have historically identified crisis surge capacity as that 120-hour window. Again, I get back to within 120 hours, it's reasonable to believe we should be able to redistribute most of the patients in the US for a conventional disaster of up to about 2,000 patients. In recognizing planning scenarios, we have to come face to face with the fact that there are scenarios out there that create crisis surge capacity for an indefinite period of time. We actually refer to that as catastrophic surge capacity. And the whole point is it's crisis surge where there's no finite time frame of when things will be back to normal. And we hypothesized a nuclear weapon detonation or a pandemic would be a couple of those examples. Not that a pandemic creates burn patients, but a pandemic dramatically compromises our ability to take care of burn patients because of how it consumes so much of the available capacity that's normally in a hospital. And then austere care guidelines were created by the American Burn Association several years ago, and they may be of great value during these scenarios where you've got limited space, limited equipment. Disaster plan triggers. The entry or the trigger point, we start out with subject matter experts. We start out with our data and our assumptions, but that helps us dial in on what could be a trigger point for our disaster plan. And then there's activity within the plan that we can model, we can test it, and we can use it during a real event. And we'll talk about the modeling. I'll use one model example in a minute. And then it's also important to recognize no plan has an infinite ability to care for all of the disaster you may face. And so with that in mind, it is important to recognize that your plan may fail at some point. What you want is framework, components of your plan to be able to carry on until you can move more resources in, something we've written about in the past called surge equilibrium. We either bring more resources in or we transport patients out, but the point is to reach that equilibrium of caregivers and patients reaching a balance. So with surge planning, we started out with the burn centers, and again relying on really the international experts, John Hick and Dan Hanfling. They were the two co-chairs of the National Academies of Science Institute of Medicine Crisis Care research that was done and published in 2013. We also presented our work there, and that included this component about burn care. What we basically did was we took the guidelines that were created by Hick and Hanfling, and we adopted it to burn care. And this is kind of an outline of what that looks like. And then a little bit more than 10 years ago, when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, I developed a model to look at how much can we absorb in the American South and the southeastern United States if there was a significant burn disaster event. And there's different types of modeling scenarios or different types of simulation you can use. One's called discrete event, one's called continuous, and one's called Monte Carlo. Again, what I was looking for was you can test various hypotheses, you can change a number of variables, and you can do that on a desktop computer without going through lots of actually manpower heavy scenarios. And so you start out with a descriptive analysis, what type of data is available. We took on some regular assumptions that a burn center can surge 50% more than stated capacity. We looked at what type of surge capacity was available in the trauma centers. And then we looked at the particular burn center that I worked with at that time, the North Carolina GC Burn Center at UNC Health. It's the 5th largest burn center in America. And so we tried to identify what that capacity was and then tried to get a feel for how much bed availability we had. Again, this particular example focuses on first UNC Health, second North Carolina, third states contiguous to it, and then last the southeastern region of the United States. Again, we had to look at our inputs. This gives you somewhat of an overview of our inputs. We used a modeling software created by At-Risk by Palisade. And Monte Carlo simulation actually dates back to working on weapons at Los Alamos, the creation of the atomic bomb. It was their way of coming up with predictive or probabilistic values of success. You have to have a distribution curve. Most hospital admissions wind up with a normal distribution, but it is important to track down your data and verify that. And then that can help you create a coefficient of variation. You've got to look at your simulations. Our input simulations included 5 real-world events and 5 theoretical events. And then we matched that against hospital capacity. Those inside the state of North Carolina, those outside the state of North Carolina that were contiguous to the state, and then the balance of the region. So our inputs, these first 5 are X1, X2, X3. So our first 5 were real world events. X6 through X10 are just theoretical numbers that we wanted to see how far we could go before we could break the model. And then the way this works is I take X1 as a real world event of 54 patients, and I compare that to the variable capacities of Y1, the home hospital. And if X1 is smaller than Y1, then it's solved. Y1 can handle the X1 event. But if it can't, then I compare X1 to Y1 plus Y2, and so on and so forth, until I either meet all of the patient's needs or I run out of hospitals. What we learned from this is we basically run out of hospitals between 400 to 475 patients. Obviously, we could absorb, again, probably about 50% more. But what that tells us in a much grander scale is if we had an event with 5,000 patients, that's a deal stopper. We can't manage that at all. And so we're going to wind up with several thousand patients who receive care outside of what is either a conventional or a contingency standard of care. Surge capacity in general is kind of broken down into space, staff, and stuff. And quite honestly, we need to really say supplies, but in all practical purposes, it is space, staff, and stuff. But these are the 3 things we need to help us create surge capacity. There are some mathematical assumptions, and again, if you have a little bit of a background in economics, what we're looking for is a static equilibrium point where where supply and demand meet, and then what are ways that we can achieve that. And again, on a regular basis, we can most all of our patients operate in this day-to-day capacity. And the probability of being in this day-to-day capacity, as we get to higher capacity, the more the probability is that we can take care of all of our patients. But there are some days that we don't, we're far less, the probability is far less that we'll be in conventional surge capacity, but it does happen. Contingency surge capacity also happens. And then crisis surge capacity, the probability of that is actually very small, but the severity of that is very significant. And then the impact of that to the American healthcare system is very significant. And so the whole point to this is to understand how to end that crisis surge. And the crisis surge, let me kind of move, well, all steps necessary to avoid or end crisis surge. And here's a good graph of surge equilibrium. If you think about either this is the disaster scene or it may be that first receiving hospital, but that's the location where the greatest cluster of patients are located. And you can address that with space, staff, and supplies. But the balance is going to be the new patients or the current patients that are already there. And then you've got to think about how you can decompress the disaster scene. Is that transferring patients away? Is it discharging patients? Honestly, it also includes our patients dying. But again, the surge equilibrium point is to understand how we achieve that surge equilibrium. That's the best way to get out of crisis surge capacity. Again, the goal is to return to day-to-day capacity. We've written plans in the past, and they're published. If you're interested in them, some of them are a little bit older today, but they at least help you understand the framework of what went into who we talked to and how we evaluated the best way to distribute or redistribute some of our patients. We also published a surge capacity checklist that's available in the literature. The whole point, and you're hearing a lot of this today with the pandemic, but the whole point to surge planning is to smooth the spike, to lower the curve. The more you can spread out how patients are being seen, the less likely you are to overwhelm the healthcare system. Now that may include bringing them to, one of several places, but it also includes good triage in terms of sorting through who does need the greatest care first, who can wait, and who can be managed in ways that may be a little bit more creative compared to traditional conventional standard of care. In surge capacity in some circumstances has included mobile hospitals. This is an example of a mobile hospital we created in North Carolina. We actually had a total of 8 of these. This is one that we set up in 2012 when the president and the Democratic National Committee came to Charlotte for their convention. Anyway, key steps at the scene. It's important to use models to help us predict both our trigger points and what type of sufficient resources we have. Quite honestly, you can't have enough resources that you will never be able to afford all of the resources you need. And so understanding how much you have and what your trigger point is to call for additional help or to look for other ways to decompress the scene is so important. Probably one of the areas that's often overlooked is transportation. Transportation resources, so many times we focus just on the hospital. It's also important to understand how we're either going to get patients to the hospital or get them transferred to other hospitals. So let's talk briefly about, do you have an inventory of what type of resources are available? Not just the common resources, but are there other governmental agencies that may be able to help you? For us, we do have access to the National Guard, and we do have access to reserves and the Coast Guard. But in some cases, it's pretty tricky to activate those resources. So figure out what that is long before the disaster occurs. Some of the more civilian resources are pretty easy to use, at least they are here in the States. Some of the governmental resources are a lot more difficult or a little bit more nuanced in how we access them. So do that during your planning situation, not during the heat of the battle. Just an example of something else that have popped up quite a bit, and that's ambuses. If you have them, they're a great way to help move a significant number of patients. Just understand if you're moving a handful of burn injured patients, identifying the staff that can be involved in that transportation would be important. Let's kind of wrap up with just a couple of final slides. One of the last things that's certainly important in the US, and I would presume is important in other places, is how do you pay for it? We look at some of our reimbursement strategies here in the US, and that's what I would tell you is what are your traditional reimbursement strategies, and then what are other ways, are there natural disaster? For us, the FEMA Stafford Act activates a certain disaster law that allows the federal government to reimburse us for certain dollars that we spend in our state. An 1135 waiver is a way that we can get reimbursed in our hospital for patients who don't normally meet certain standards. But the important thing is to look for those financial planning pieces long before the disaster occurs, so that it's very easy to stand this up and get this done during a disaster. It is important to recognize that there's a cost associated with preparedness, but it's a great return on investment. And let me give you just a couple of examples. You do have good return on investment when you're successfully able to manage it, when you avert a disaster because of your mitigation strategies. For us, it's important for accreditation, and so it's important to have good disaster preparedness so that you have a successful accreditation visit. And if you have a federally declared disaster, again, at least here in the US, we want to get our expenses refunded, and we can do that if we have a good disaster plan in place. It is difficult to equate sometimes the cost benefit. Again, in the United States, we have something called a DRG. It relates to a certain amount of reimbursement for a certain type of thing that you did. We don't have that for disaster preparedness, and so sometimes it falls off of the radar screen for hospital administrators, but it's incredibly important. And I can't tell you enough how well you need to be prepared for things that will happen. Hope is not a plan. Okay, hope is not a substitute for a plan. It is important to not try to shame or fear people into understanding the need. It is important to understand the importance of compliance. If you create a good safety of atmosphere of preparedness, then people are more likely to be involved. And then your return on investment on preparedness activities, things that we've talked about before. Plans are all about relationships. Who do you know? Who can help you? Who do you call? What can they bring? Who can you send patients to? What type of plans do you have? Are your plans scalable? If you think your plan is scalable to the point that it will take on all types of disasters, you've probably got too big of a plan, or you've overestimated its capabilities. All plans will fail at some point. But you have framework pieces in place that will carry you forward until you can get it under control. You can't plan for everything, but it is important to plan for the key pieces. And again, as I've said before, education is such a game changer. You know, your takeaway points, what do you know about your jurisdiction? How engaged are you? What type of time is involved in some of these components? And again, plan activation or plan failure. What could cause your plan to fail? And then how do you wrap that up? I hope this has been informative. I appreciate your time today. You can reach me at either of the two email addresses below. Again, I'm Dr. Randy Kearns. I've been involved in burn disaster operations and burn disaster planning for a while, and I look forward to hearing from you if you do have questions. Thank you again.